So, welcome everybody to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle that is sponsored by Still and Moving Meditation Fellowship. And Cliff Tillotson is going to read the back cover of our 2025 Almanac.
From Carl Sagan, Evolving with the Cosmos. The cosmos is full beyond measure of elegant truths, of exquisite interrelationships, of the awesome machinery of nature. The surface of the earth is the shore of the cosmic ocean. On this shore, we've learned most of what we know. Recently, we've waded a little way out, maybe ankle deep, and the water seems inviting. Some part of our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return, and we can, because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. You can hear that over and over, huh?
Yes, and we do every week for the year. Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to our conversation this week that will be on the idea of emerging from the cave. And in creating this theme, I was very much thinking in terms of Plato's allegory of the cave. And we are so fortunate to have Marianne Huber-Sachs, who is going to be able to unfold this a little bit. It's something that she's very interested in, and she really has a very deep philosophical background. And I'm going to let you tell us a little bit more about yourself, Marianne, before you give your presentation. And we're so looking forward to it.
Thank you, and mahalo, Renee. And I'm going to introduce what's relevant in my background, in that I am in San Luis Obispo. I own a conscious living space and gift shop and gallery, which means that I am constantly working with philosophies from different traditions, bringing them together as a participant, or rather a guide. That interest in bringing people together came from my studies in international health, philosophy, and political science, where I brought together world leaders. I was not the leader, to discuss, to negotiate, to create and establish new ways of moving into the world. This was very formal and sponsored by the university system here in California, as well as the University of Miami, which was a congressional oversight community oversight program of the North-South Center, which is a parallel to the East-West Center. And so the topic of this, moving into some of the cave and out of the cave into the cosmic, into the divine light, if you will, was influenced by how we got people together to change their minds and negotiate peace. My own background is as a massage therapist at this point, and so I do that individually, day by day, working with people. So that's my background. And I'd like to go ahead and share my screen and use this. So I'm going to work on that possibility to hope for the best. And I am sharing my screen right now.
There it is. Hooray.
So my name is Mary Huber-Sachs. I'm going to be talking about a little bit divergent from just the coming up into the light, which was how Renee presented this. And for those of us who would like to just have a short review of the cave analogy, there is the ascent and there's a descent back. My tradition that I want to propose to us today in the GEMS tradition is the Christian contemplative direction of using Christian Platonic spirituality to look at this Plato's story and discussion. The cave presents a philosophical dialogue about enlightenment, and the dialogue was Socrates having a conversation with Glaucon, I don't know how to say his name, on the nature of education, reality, and governance. In the allegory, and this is what is presented as a story or a proverb, if you will, there's a structure of 3 aspects. And the first is the imprisoned state. So in my picture, you see, and in the is this idea of prisoners who have been chained in subterranean darkness, and they are fixed by chains at their throat and their feet. And so the idea, this is they've been since childhood and matured into this, but the only thing that they are allowed to see or do is see the shadows and comment on that. In that imprisoned state and in that reflection, it is said that it's an illusion. And Socrates asked Glaucon about this. Do you see that they're just seeing the shadow? And that's a limited understanding, because behind the scenes are people and a fire creating the shadow effect. That is the perspective of limited insight. And that limited insight into our knowing self is that if we're so limited that we're only seeing the shadows, we may not have the deepest ability to understand and examine beyond our current awareness, dogma, or even, status. At one point, the prisoners, one is selected to be forced into an ascent. Now, that would take undoing them from the chain of the throat and the legs, and that immersion turned that person around in a Greek term known as periagoge, and that person was forced, or rather forced, to face the light and do this rugged climb. And that goes up this canyon into a cave entrance to the light. And you can imagine the word forced is real, because they had never walked, they had never seen a fire, they had never faced the ability to turn their head in a new way. And that itself took some prompting, some courage, and some guidance. But they made it up to the light. And we're going to go into that in a moment. But then after a bit, there is a descent. And Plato continues on to discuss what that descent means. And that will go into my Christian spirituality. Again, the changed perception, if you can imagine, the mistaken perception, the binding, looked at cultural conditioning and systemic blindness. So when you get to the top of the cave and you're opened up to the real light of the sun, or even if it's dark, it's different. It's no longer shadows. The rugged climb in Plato's presentation and Socrates' discussion is that it's getting rid of the illusions that you can do it, and the ego death that you are trapped into one thing. The forced descent is a concept of Dionia, which is where the prisoner is forced to drag themselves through the steep incline, leaving the lower realm of the false certainty and false self. When you get to the sun is the most captivating, and is that you merge into the daylight. And this is when we as contemplatives, or we as spiritual people, emerge into this direct contemplation of good, the ultimate source of life. In the story, in the allegory, it starts small. It starts by seeing a shadow because of casting shadow from the light. And then it's looking into a reflection of the water, and then discerning that the reflection is us. So ultimately, with time, with cultivation of being in the light, that influence of the God sense or the greater sense of consciousness is understood and is illuminated to the individual. And we might look at that as the spiritual practices in any traditions when we come to practice and open ourselves to these new understandings. Mary, next slide. Yes. Once we do that, say we become a sage, or say this particular prisoner became a sage, and that seeking truth and enlightenment, it's not complete until we return back to the subterranean den. Socrates proposed this because this re-entering the darkness makes us face the awkwardness of knowing something and then trying to communicate it to those who are still chained. And I see this a lot. I think I know something, I try to explain it, and I don't. But I think that this is the challenge of many mystics in trying to communicate to us over the eons. And it takes going back ourselves, back to the light, reflecting on the practice, the script, the prostrations, and going back into the real life that we live and seeing if we can embody it. And this transformation from going up and going down is part of what Plato really was concerned with in the Republic itself, as I understand it from these chapters. And that is, we're really about education and transforming society where it's unitive service, where everyone's brought back into the light. And the systemic global illusion is eradicated. And therefore, the city-state is able to proliferate in the highest way, in the good way, in the most moral and just way. Something happens that there needs to be a catharsis in this type of an action. The whole journey makes us have to face the light. And that's the essence that I'm getting from our work here in the gems, looking at the cosmos. Every talk this year that I've attended has opened me up just a little bit more to reorient myself to the wholeness of the journey. So this story does speak to me as I looked at it this week about many aspects of this journey that are profoundly expanded upon by each of you who shared your talks previous. The other aspect that comes with that, and I mentioned, is how hard it is to explain or to really say, but I've got this truth, or you might have felt that this is so obvious, but there's a helplessness when it's not really returned. And that's within this study. So I chose to talk about this because I grew up with this story in a way. My brother, John Ubersax, is a philosopher, religious scholar, and studied as well psychology. And his life's work was in Platonic Christianity. He's defined the reframing of Plato's Republic as the psychopolis, and it is the city of the soul, where sub-personalities must be harmonized under wisdom. So, as a psychologist, John would talk to me about many of the masters that he studied, including Plato, and also he spoke about Jungian truths, about incorporating aspects of our personality that have to come into the whole for us to really have full consciousness. So John, just being exposed to his thoughts, sometimes he would be in like a Socratic way, just posing a question to me and waiting for me to come up with something. And respond. So it's a great way of teaching and thought-provoking. And it's led me to continue to learn or be excited when I ask questions of this group. The architects that he talks about as Christian, he's going into the Christian Platonic tradition, is about spiritual unification. And John continued to talk about the actors in the Bible as parts and personalities that are unified through the parables and stories that we as Christians have read and talk about and are lectured with. And that leads me to why, to a man that I was introduced to, Father Thomas Keating, who's one of such people who have interpreted this Platonic tradition. And I'll move to his perception of this. While he did not talk specifically about this story, his life's work became focused on two things. Father Keating, born in the United States, moved in, I think, 1983 to develop something called the Snowmath Interface Conference. In his Trappist, very cloistered and quiet, contemplative way, he rediscovered that the ancient monastic traditions and practices of other traditions created spiritual transformation. Father Keating went on to write a great deal, and this is similar to my brother's work, about how this forces us to go into shadow work through the contemplative tradition. And if you go back to the analogy, it's great to have an awakening and be in a place where you're singing hymns and you feel light and pure and reflective, and you're taking in the Holy Spirit's blessing. But the Holy Spirit directs the individual back into that unification again. It's a deep call that is a must when you start reflecting on your shadow self. The shadow practices of humanity, the disruption of looking at life the way it is. And Father Keating was really a person who was in a great deal of pain physically, had early lung issues, but also the Trappist legacy was also very brutal and isolating and created some challenges for him, which he worked on until his last publication before he died at the age of 93. His work on dismantling the false self was something I worked on and studied during COVID. And I went deeper into it as he talked about gnosis. And I'm thinking, I want to make sure I'm staying wounded human condition. And the way that Father Keating developed centering prayer was so that everyone could access it. Everyone could start to get into that quieting of the mind. And he calls centering prayer, which I have done a talk on before when I first started the Gems, is a tradition of sitting in intentional silence, consent to God's presence, where the mind drops surface distractions, traumas, wounds, and shadow material. Father Keating brought together through interfaith Suzuki traditions, Buddhist traditions, Sufi traditions, and many other cultural expressions of interfaith. He cultivated that dialogue, and thus I think you can see where meditation and centering prayer have a synergistic relationship, and it's often talked about. They can share common space and common goals towards the light of enlightenment. And the eye of the soul, looking towards nous, is having undergone inner purification. The soul endures the radiant light outside the cave, and being blinded, beginning to grasp the absolute cosmic unification. And this introduces the form of good that Plato and Socrates presented to the human challenge. And thus, the rational discursive brain of Dionia, which is substandard, if you will, to the greater knowing eye of the soul, is now made visible so that one can come from a higher sense of truth. These are some terms that were new to me, and so I'm not prolific, but I know that some of you are much more prolific on some of these philosophical ideas. But what struck me from my idea of a background in political economy and development was that it was guided by love. And that allowed us to transmute the selflessness through unconditional love. That's why we go back to the cave. Somehow there's a striking impulse in humanity, if you will, and maybe the collective Gaia, to return to that cave. It is supported by courage, because as we reflect on Plato's descent, the discussion is that the prisoner returning is chided and criticized because he can't any longer see what they see. In fact, he's blinded by the darkness. So he has to step back in and keep his alertness to a new way of understanding, to find that sense that he's beyond captivity, but able to relate to the same images, but but no longer in an illusion, in a sense of truth and reality. So again, the idea that there was acceptance of a Christian tradition of the other truths was mind-blowing to me, because it was only beginning to be shed how interfaith dialogue was happening with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh. Suzuki coming to these lands and meeting with him was revealing. And I actually learned about him at a workshop on Yogananda. So I think that my lifetime was enhanced by this interfaith dialogue. And some of the other things that bring us into this radical compassion in many traditions include Sufism. Well, I list here indigenous ecological wisdom, Eastern traditions, Kabbalah, and these mystical lineages. Kenosis, as to really reach the mind of enlightenment, is bodhicitta. And one of this reasons why that soul does go back into the journey is that it's not just for self-optimization, but to open a heart in radical compassion for all suffering beings. And I'm almost done, but I wanted to bring in the idea of egoless leadership and unitive consciousness. And I don't know why I want to direct that, but because, again, Plato was talking to the city-state. And the idea of egoless leadership, shadow-free action, and flourishing for all led me to one other individual that I could use as a quick analogy for our conversation. And that is Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for 27 years, was in Robben Island, and was forced into that cave, limited understanding and ability, but he found a way to be out of the cave through vigorous, internal, rigorous self-reflection. And he came out of the cave no longer a prisoner to his own limited beliefs. He came out of the cave and proceeded a leadership in South Africa, and fought against great ridicule, literally going back into the cave, because he faced the idea of bringing everyone back into the whole, of reunification, along with Desmond Tutu's Ubuntu work, brought back in this idea of we are all have the dignity, all come together, all must be pulled out of this illusion of separateness. And so I went into that in an effort to try to talk to you all. I have another slide that may or may not be able to be pulled up. Can you follow me? No.
We see your questions.
Can you see this picture?
We see questions.
Okay. So I'd like to just go back into your own traditions, or your spiritual paths, or cultural backgrounds, to recognizing or reflecting upon the cave and the calling to unchain human awareness. Also, the idea of the allegory to the broader theme of the cosmos. How does this bring individual soul transformation with systemic service and collective whole? Those are my ideas to throw out to the community. I hope I've pulled it together in enough stimulating way to go ahead and go with that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I told you she was philosophically deep, didn't I? She's amazing. I wanted to just make sure that we all have some sort of a clear picture of the allegory as Plato describes it to us. And we got a visual of it on the email that we received. And so you can see a visual of how these prisoners are trapped in a cave. They're chained head and foot, as Marianne was telling us. There's a fire behind them, and there are these puppets that they don't get to see the puppets, but the puppets' shadows from the fire are reflected upon the wall in front of them. And so they're not even looking at the puppets, they're looking at the shadows of the puppets. And these puppets are going through their lifetimes. It's kind of like watching a soap opera. And that's all they have to do in that cave, is they're just sitting there watching the soap opera going on amongst all the puppets, interacting with each other, having fights and whatever they're doing with one another. And their comments about this the show going on is if that's all they have in their lives is these puppet shows. There's nothing else going on for them. And to me, it kind of reminds me of when we go out into public and we see so many people just on their phones, right? Everybody's looking at their screens and thinking that's reality. And they can be in the midst of some beautiful spot in nature and they're on their phones. Sometimes it's us that are doing that. And so I'm just trying to give us kind of a picture of, what is at the front of the allegory before even going behind it deeper to see what it means. So when one of these prisoners finally succeeds in unchaining themselves from the cave, they're not just instantly in the light. No, they have to make their way up this long tunnel. It's an arduous task to get up this tunnel and then into that light of day. And when they first get out into the light, they are completely blinded by the light. They can't see because they've spent their whole lifetimes in darkness with just the reflected shadows of the light of that fire behind them. And then Plato goes on to say that those who, with, as Marianne says, love and courage, return back into the cave to try to set their fellow prisoners free, they're met with absolute scorn and ridicule, because to them the only thing that's real is these, shadows of the puppets that they're seeing on the wall in front of them. They cannot conceptualize what he's even talking about, or she's talking about, in terms of this light that's up there, and there's this whole amazing world, technicolor, living, moving, breathing world that you can be part of too, not chained. And they can't recognize that they're even bound by chains. It's kind of like if you've ever tried to get a teenager unhooked from their phone. Like, that's just disastrous to them. What do you mean you're going to cut me off from all of my contacts with my friends? That's my life. It's in this phone. Has anybody else been told that by a teenager? Or am I the only one who's heard that? So just to kind of to get a superficial view of what this allegory is, I just wanted to make sure that kind of we share that in common. So then we can look at, okay, so what is this an allegory of, right? What does this mean? What does this teach us? Right? And from that perspective, can you show us your questions again, Marianne? Or maybe you could just restate them for us, or one of the two, one of your two questions. How would you ask that question for us? See, maybe you can unmute. Yeah. You can't unmute? Oh, there you go. Oh, okay.
The first question really was, in your own tradition, spiritual path, or cultural background, how do you recognize and reflect upon the cave and the calling to unchained human awareness? If I were to try to explain my Christian contemplative tradition to another person, I'd have to lift myself up to connect to that person and really hear them as well. And that means my neck would have to be able to turn, my heart would have to be open. So just in your own tradition, I'm just wondering how people have seen an opening in the Buddhist, the Zen, the indwelling work of the Hawaiian traditions, and anyone else who's represented here.
So how would we, if we were somebody who managed to make it out of the cave into the light,
and you come down and you're looking to help unchain, how would you evaluate that drama of trying to help someone turn out of their darkness, out of their illusion? You mentioned the children, so I was just kind of use Nelson Mandela as an opportunity because he had to convert people. But in Keating's chance, he went back into the divine therapy, and that's how he would look at it. So I didn't know if there was something open in the other traditions that are reflective here. Help me out, Diane.
Okay, I don't know. What is actually coming to me is the dark night of the soul. That for me, being in the cave is the dark night of the soul, and that I am chained many times by how I perceive something from my wounded stories or from my past. And it's in meditation that I can go underneath that. And what I have found is that when I come out of that dark night of the soul, for me to share that with others is mostly to listen. That I cannot change anyone. I cannot change their journey, but I can share my journey, or I can be visible to them. But I can also just listen to where they're at and have love and compassion for them. That I think even when I do therapy, it's like what I do is I listen and I try to understand where they're coming from. Because for me, in the dark night of the soul, having a lot of compassion for my wounded parts, and my wounded stories allows, if I listen to them and those different parts, then I can bring them back into wholeness, because I'm not shaming, I'm not saying they're wrong, I'm saying this is my truth. And so when I think of working with other people, it is loving, showing unconditional love and kindness, and also being able to reflect back and have them be really visible. So that's what I was thinking about.
Thank you so much. Really help.
Thank you for that. I think this was my brother's direction into it, is that it makes him more whole and able to then take philosophy back into the world. He went on to debate and dialogue as a candidate for Congress in that direction, and try to listen in that debate. And so I think that's quite interesting. So the second question also is about, how does collective service put you back? And I keep thinking of AA as a spiritual program, puts people into a collective service, which is freedom from self and illusion. But any other thoughts or traditions that people might want to comment on? Or if you all felt that your chain was removed of your throat and your feet were mobile for the first time, and you could touch people from that, how does your tradition give you an opportunity to reach out and discover that?
Or if you have another question or another comment to make. Oh, Cliff, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mariage. I encountered this allegory my freshman year in college. It had a tremendous impact on me back then, and it stayed with me all my adult life as kind of a template for understanding, both ourselves individually and also in a collective sense. A lot of the dynamics that are at play in human life and human relationships and human society. So I was just kind of pondering on the idea of chains. How do we get the chains? What are the chains? And then, of course, as you're saying, Marianne, how do we get unshackle ourselves from these chains? And the thoughts that have gone through my head is we create the world we live in. We could be living in a golden age, but we could also be living in a dark age. And I think it's predominantly when you imagine the people at the back of the cave, all in chains, they're chaining themselves, but especially they're chaining each other. And so when we go about seeing the limitations of others, we get involved in reducing others rather than seeing the potentials of others, rather than deeply listening to others, understanding others, trying to create bridges between others, as Desmond Tutu and what was the other guy in South Africa?
Nelson.
Nelson Mandela did. They were the ones that tried to bring everyone back together again. But I see this at work so much in our society with like identity politics, pitting one tradition against another, one religious tradition against another, instead of them all being pathways to more deep understanding of themselves and the universe in a divine way. You know, the tension between the genders, the tension between any kind of us, them kind of modality is us putting chains on others. And so it's kind of like this collective pulling down that goes on, but it's mainly, what's interesting in the story is these puppeteers behind the wall using these puppets to put images onto the wall in front of the prisoners. Those are oftentimes leaders and political leaders, state leaders. They could be religious leaders. They could be any kind of leader who, for some reason or another, wants to control and manipulate others for their own good. That's why the leaders in Plato's Polis were supposed to be poor, have no monetary value at all. They were supposed to be completely dedicated servants of the whole. But so I'm just thinking about, in your story of it, how do these chains come about, and how can we individually be ones that not only loosen the chains on ourselves, but on all the others that we encounter in daily life? So that's what you got me thinking about, Marianne. So.
Jade, did you want to make a comment?
Oh, maybe I'll just jump in really fast. Following off on what Cliff shared, yeah, I also have questions about, you know, the puppeteers. Because it stands to reason, I guess, for me, that the puppeteers must be like prisoners who have escaped the chains somehow, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to be behind their puppeting behind the scenes. So yeah, that makes me think of, I don't know, it makes me think of Star Wars, really. How, you know, you have these Jedi powers, right, which could be an analogy for spiritual awakening, or awakening to like reality, not just the shadow. And with that comes power. And then, you know, if that power is not used in an ethical way or abused in some way, like that's possibly how we get those puppeteers, right? So that's something that I have questions about, you know, if Plato speaks on what the motives, who these puppeteers are and what their motives are. And I'm also really curious, as a mental health counselor that mainly works with people with trauma, like what role trauma may play in that forced pushing, pedagogy. At least for me in my personal life, I feel like trauma was actually incredibly educative. Like early on trauma, you know, and then as a young adult, an adult growing up, and like really having that suffering very intensely was what motivated me to take major efforts to come to the reality of things. I feel like if I hadn't had a lot of trauma early on, I wouldn't have made like relatively happy with the puppet show and just keep going. So I'm wondering if there's anything either in Plato or like further on in the scholarship that talks about what creates that push towards the real world.
In other words, you had two questions. What is motivating the puppeteers and making them so manipulative of the mindset of others? And I'm sure that we see this not only in the political sphere, but we see it definitely in the commercial sphere. It's pretty clear motivation for money, for power, self-aggrandizement in different ways. Now, your other question was, though, what is it that could motivate the prisoner to break out of their chains and move towards the light? And for you, your own suffering. It sounds like, began to be very aware that you were being chained, that you were stuck in something that you didn't want to be stuck in, and maybe you didn't need to be stuck in. And so that in and of itself sounds like it was a motivator for you to find a way to break those chains and to start making your ascent toward the light. That's a
Yeah.
really interesting point.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's anything on there. The first question though is less like what's the motivation behind it? Because yeah, it's pretty easy, money, power, etc. But are those people also by nature of where they are, projecting the shadows of onto others who are chained? Like, are they liberated prisoners? Like, and if so, how did they liberate themselves, and then how did they get twisted to then basically enchain others? That's my question.
Interesting. Yeah. Is there a danger even for somebody who's gone up to the surface? They've emerged out into the light. They come back down. They are blinded again because now their eyes aren't used to darkness. Could they somehow get kind of twisted around, forget about the wonderfulness of that world up there, and decide instead to start manipulating the puppets?
Exactly.
Oh, great question. Is there an answer within Plato that either Marianne or Cliff know of? I don't think the rest of us may be quite as familiar with the allegory itself as Plato tells it.
One of there is a catalyst of going back in and sitting with the laborers, and it's an enduring of the hardship of being there, but in that, knowing the truth, and you're still with those illusions, confronting them, you become a person who can be able to bring others into the light. Now, if your eyes adjust, you go back to the cave and you have this inner insight and awareness, as I was using Nelson Mandela, and as the example, he knows that true unification is there. So he can sit with the enemy, or if you will, which may be seen as the puppeteers. He can sit with the people who are oppressed in Soweto, and he can be the light because his innate awareness of truth has created a catharsis. And I use another person is Mother Teresa and Dorothy Day, who go into impoverished communities, and people go into great struggle, and they just sit with them. They just are with them. They may bring food. These are people who, through their traditions, felt that sitting with people in hospice, or who have leprosy, or who were in food lines, allow them to just answer the questions from the light. Because as Diana said, people will bring their trauma, their confusion, and those breakthroughs are the crystallization, moving to truth person by person, situation by situation. Plato wanted the leaders to be humble and to be free of ego. And that's pretty much the discourse around this, is educators, free of ego and free of politics, were the best people to do it. So that's how I saw the rest of the discussion from the Platonic way, and using these real life examples, just by sitting in the streets and doing night service with the homeless, that type. I don't know if that helps. And that, I think, addresses Cliff's issues. That's how you can face down an enemy, is by sitting with.
Yeah, good
Can I
point.
just, can I just interject before Jade comes in? Jade's got a lot. I can see her eyes rolling there. So I just want to say the way I interpret the allegory is that those people that are the puppeteers never got out of the cave. They're kind of like in the Star Wars, made like Darth Vader or something. They were on the path. They made it some ways out of the cave, but then they got enamored of the light coming in through the entrance of the cave on the walls of the cave, which is different than the firelight against the back wall. They got some powers by somehow getting free of the chains, but never truly made it out. And you could use this story in terms of the Buddhist tradition that there is the path that takes you out of the cave, which is the Dharmakaya path, and then there's the path coming back into the cave, which is the Bodhisattva path. Some people do make it out, but never come back, because who wants to really? But it's that love of others and the feeling of the suffering of others that draws them back. But those people that are working behind as puppeteers, they're bad. Just bad. Go ahead.
Well, in the sense, you mean of being personally motivated.
And manipulating, deliberately, consciously manipulating other people and pitting. Basically, what they're doing is they're pitting the prisoners against each other. That's what I think they're doing mainly. That's the trick of power is to divide people, tradition to tradition, political class, the Iranians against the Americans or whatever it is, we're just dividing each other all the time, racism, all that has to do with those pitting of people against each other. And there's puppeteers behind all that. I'm sorry, Jade, I'm getting on my.
And you're saying that this is because from the Platonic standpoint, they are still in ignorance. They have not truly reached the light. And
found a clever way to have power by pushing other people against each other while they stay on top of it and gain the fruits of other people's efforts.
And so basically, Plato would probably explain that as them fundamentally not knowing any better, that they haven't reached
like
that
sophists,
unification.
They're like the sophists and the leaders in the polis who are controlling others and stuff like that.
Yeah. They haven't realized themselves as being one with all. So therefore, they're setting themselves aside, apart from the rest of the people, like the captives, and they are pitting the captives against each other. They haven't reached that unified consciousness that Marianne's just talking about, that is symbolized by reaching the light. But it's still an interesting proposition that Schuyler makes, that there may be some danger, some sacrificial danger in going back into the darkness and kind of getting lost down there in the cave, and not only not being able to get back up themselves, but also losing an ability to help anybody else get up. But they do have a certain amount of powers that they might put to use in this more manipulative way. So it's interesting. Yeah, thank you. Jade, we're really opening the floor to you.
Mahalo nui loa, everyone, for sharing your perspectives. And Marianne, thank you for being so inquisitive and doing a philosophical deep dive. That was very beautiful. And I feel like I heard a lot of parallels between what you shared and what Cliff shared about going into the cave and coming out, going up to the mountain and then coming back down before ascending higher. And I remember in both stories, and Cliff talked about last week how coming back down and then going to the village, and then just seeing the difference between like heart-minded heart and people acting from mind versus heart, people acting from being connected to nature versus to illusion or on their phones or on trivial things. And And I I think one of the things that I'm an ardent student of is of nature and of the Tao, and my understanding of this came from nature. And I'm gonna be a little bit vulnerable and share. So about 5 years ago, I felt I went through an enlightenment, an enlightening moment, and just so richly blessed to have that, and a lot of guidance from Deshane here. And I suddenly felt just peace and joy enter my whole being, my whole understanding of it, my whole understanding of enlightenment, and just is letting go of all illusion, letting go of the trivial minded things, and just being light. And I felt this peace and joy enter, and I just knew it was a part of me. And through self-cultivation, just consistent self-cultivation, through observation of nature, through reading the Tao, learning different philosophies like you all are ardent students of, and through constant vigorous reflection and like Shiva stepping on the ego, I felt this peace and joy just continue growing. And for about a year, I felt I was in a meditative cave. Not the same cave analogy, but I felt I was in a meditative cave. And about year 2, I would come out of the cave and I would talk to people, and I just felt they couldn't feel that I would try to explain that, the peace and the love and the joy, and people were so attached to their identities and the suffering, the egos. And I would keep trying to come out and then or come down the mountain and then go back up, come down the mountain, and continue to self-cultivate. And I think being an ardent student of nature and being an ardent student of one of the texts that changed my life was the Tao Te Ching. And in the Tao, it says, the supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without trying to. It goes to even the lowest places that people disdain. The water goes to the ocean, which is the lowest place, and yet it also goes to the highest place, from the clouds to the mountains to the rivers, and then back out, and it just keeps making this cycle. And it helped me understand that I can also be in that cycle, and how I try to continue to illuminate that peace and joy and help people understand, or not really understand, help people make little breakthroughs, I feel is helping them connect with nature. And by being an ardent student of nature, I feel like I have witnessed so many hundreds of miracles from nature. And we share that through our stories or intentions when we do Qigong. Through Qigong, I am able to embody the nature and help people feel that love and that peace and that joy in themselves. And that has just expanded to like tea and other areas. And so I continue to be a student and to try to be like that water. Mahalo nui.
I feel as if every person here is someone who, to the extent that we have any little bit of light, we want to share it with others, every single one of us. And it's quite rewarding to be in a group where we feel as if we all have that in common. You know, maybe we haven't gotten all the way out into the full light, but you know, any little drops of light that we have, we seem to want to share. And that gives me tremendous hope. It's so wonderful to hear everybody's stories and everybody's efforts to do that sharing of the light. And I want to thank Mariange for just really taking us on an amazing journey that she herself was, I know, very much assisted on by her brother John. And he sounds like a person of tremendous insight. And what a tribute your presentation to us was to him. Your presentation to us was a tribute to him, Mariange. And I hope that you'll have an opportunity to thank him for maybe we're getting part of his reflected light as well as your own inner light, sharing with us your insights and you know, motivated by so much compassion. We so much appreciate that. I do want to say that next week's talk is going to be, or presentation is going to be by somebody who is right here on the screen. Well, she's behind the screen at this direct moment, but it's the topic of self-surrender. And Skylar is going to speak with us on 12-step type programs. So it's the peer-led self-help tradition. And so that will be a really interesting topic after these last couple of topics. Self-surrender, what does that actually mean? How does that have to do with ascending to the mountain and coming down, or going up from the cave and coming back down? Where does self-surrender fit into that? Because we've already talked about people who are chained to a wall. What does it mean to go into self-surrender? Oh my goodness. So this will be very interesting as a follow-up conversation. So thank you all for participating, and great thanks to Mariange and also to your brother, John. Thank you so much.
Mahalo. Thank you.
Aloha. Thank you.
Aloha.
Thank you.
That was great,
Thank you,
Marianne. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mariange.
for the opportunity. I appreciate looking into this. So,
Oh, I was so happy to have you volunteer last week, and I saw you do that little chat note. I was, yes, that's a perfect person. It's really,
I
thank you.
think, yeah, I'll let you know how it goes, whether it brought his light. I love what you said at the end. That's so meaningful. And he's aware who you are. And when I share that, that's how this led to that, it'll just be a little bit more light in the world. So that's good.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Aloha.
Namaste.
Did you want to say something, Cliff?
She's already gone.
Sorry.
That's okay. See you.